hear me? Okay, welcome. This is our final presentations of the Painting Pairs Research Collaborative. And the program is just about to finish its 14th year. So we're very excited about that. And we have 5 talks this afternoon. You'll remember back in January that our pairs presented their paintings and set out the research questions. And over the course of the academic year, each of the pairs have explored ways which technical study can contribute to art historical scholarship and vice versa. And they've been working hard to gather the contextual material and analyze the paintings. They've been in the libraries and the archives and the studio and the lab. And today they're going to be presenting the results to you. And as we did in the first presentations, we're going to deliver the talks in chronological order. We're beginning with the earliest paintings from Trecento, Italy, and then we're ending in post-war Britain. Each of the pairs are going to introduce themselves. They're going to reintroduce you to the projects and their paintings before weaving through what we like to call the triple helix of their combined research. Each group is also going to field their own questions. So there'll be questions after each of the presentations. And then at the end of today's symposium, we would like to invite you all to our celebratory drinks reception, which is going to be held in the Research Forum meeting room, which is just down the hall. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first pair.
Hi everyone, my name is Daniela and I'm the conservation student.
My name is Spencer. I'm the MA History of Art student here.
So in our first presentation, we introduced the enthronement triptych. We explored its historical and artistic context, and we identified several questions regarding its attribution, construction, and conservation history. We also carried out an initial condition assessment and preliminary technical imaging, which revealed evidence of past interventions and highlighted areas requiring further investigation.
Today, Daniela and I will present the results of our technical examination in art historical research and discuss how these findings have helped us address our initial research questions.
Together, and by combining technical evidence with archival and comparative research, we have been able to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the object, its possible origins, and subsequent history. These results have also informed treatment decisions and identified directions for future research.
Beginning with the provenance of our painting, the earliest reference to our triptych appears in the Federico Zeri photo archive, where the work is cataloged as the property of the Frazione collection in Florence as of 1956. A black and white photograph of the central panel accompanies this note in the Zeri archive as seen here. The triptych was then sold at Christie's London on April 1st, 1960 as Lot 119, the property of a nobleman. It was purchased by Horace A. Buttery, a distinguished English conservator of paintings, alongside Colin Agnew. According to the director's report of the Barber Institute for 1960, the triptych was bought from Buttery for £6,000 prior to October 1st of 1960. In 1962, the triptych was included as exhibit number 3 in an exhibition at the Royal Academy of London, where the catalog identifies the nobleman who sold the work at Christie's as Count M. Pinchy, a Parisian collector. This aligns with the Royal Academy label on the back of the triptych's modern frame, as well as the label from the Parisian Shipping Company, which features Count Pinchy's name written in pencil.
As mentioned in the previous presentation, initial observations and technical imaging suggested that the painting had undergone multiple conservation campaigns. To investigate this further, I began with non-invasive analytical techniques, starting with X-ray fluorescence imaging, or XRF. XRF works by directing X-rays onto the surface of an object. These X-rays excite the atoms present in the material, causing them to emit secondary X-rays, known as fluorescent X-rays. Because each element emits radiation at characteristic energies, it is possible to identify which elements are present within the analyzed area. When performed as macro XRF, or MA-XRF, the instrument scans across the surface of the painting and records elemental information point by point. These data can be then visualized as elemental maps, allowing us to see the distribution of individual elements across the painting. This enables us to identify areas containing specific elements and, in turn, to propose the pigments that may be present. For a 14th century Italian painting, we would expect to encounter elements associated with historical pigments, such as potassium, iron, copper, mercury, and lead. However, XRF also revealed several unexpected elements, including chromium, manganese, barium, zinc, and titanium. Thanks to the archival photograph identified by Spencer, it was possible to compare the painting's current appearance with an earlier state, before it entered England. This comparison revealed several features that appear different today, including areas of the Virgin's hand and parts of the brooch. When comparing the archival image with the painting's current appearance, alterations to the shape of the fingers become apparent. Elemental mapping of this area revealed the presence of both zinc and titanium-containing pigments. Returned to the UV image, the darker, non-fluorescent retouching associated with the most recent intervention corresponds closely to areas rich in titanium. This suggests that at least 2 conservation campaigns have taken place since the archival photograph was taken. One appears to involve a zinc-based white pigment, likely zinc white, while a later intervention utilized a titanium-based pigment, likely titanium white. You will hear more about these materials in later presentations, but for now, it is important to note that zinc white was introduced in the late 18th century and became widely available during the 19th century, while titanium white was not commercially introduced until the 1920s. Their presence, therefore, provides a terminus post quem for these restoration campaigns and demonstrates that significant retouching occurred during the modern history of the painting. To better understand the painting's conservation history and to estimate how much original material remains visible, I created this composite map using the elements most closely associated with restoration campaigns. Combined with close examination under magnification, this provided a useful overview of the painting's condition and the distribution of later interventions. Based on these observations, I have provisionally divided conservation history into interventions occurring before and after 1956. This distinction may prove useful when considering future treatment options, particularly if a decision is made to retain evidence of certain historical restoration campaigns, rather than removing all non-original material. In addition to investigating the conservation history, sampling also allowed me to study the materials used in the Virgin's robe. Analysis suggests that the robe was originally painted using ultramarine blue alone. This original paint layer, visible in the lighter blue areas, is now heavily degraded. Under magnification, it can be seen that later resinous retouchings have penetrated cracks and losses within the original paint surface. The identification of ultramarine was initially supported by microscopic examination and XRF analysis. The elemental maps showed little evidence for copper or cobalt, which might indicate the presence of other historical blue pigments such as azurite or smalt. To investigate this further, I carried out cross-sectional analysis using Raman spectroscopy. Raman spectroscopy is a molecular analytical technique that uses laser light to identify materials based on their vibrational structure. When a laser interacts with a material, a small proportion of the light is scattered at different energies. These energy shifts are characteristic of specific molecular bonds and crystal structures. By comparing the resulting spectra with reference databases and published spectra, it is possible to identify individual pigments and other materials present within a sample. The Raman results confirmed my initial hypothesis. The degraded blue particles corresponded exclusively to ultramarine, while some of the later resinous retouchings contained Prussian blue, a synthetic pigment first manufactured in the early 18th century and commercially available from 1704 onwards. These findings support the interpretation that the altered appearance of the robe results from degradation of the original ultramarine layer, combined with later restoration campaigns employing more modern blue pigments.
In terms of iconography, the Barber triptych recalls the Byzantine Hodegetria type, or one who shows the way, in which the Virgin gestures towards Christ as the path to salvation. Here, the enthroned Madonna recalls Maestà iconography as well, emphasizing Mary's majesty as the Queen of Heaven. The Virgin and Child are depicted on a substantially larger scale than the standing saints in the Barber shutters, which emphasizes Christ's divinity and Mary's role as supreme intercessor between humanity and God. Mary's possession of a book, a detail not explicitly mentioned in Scripture, relates to the theology of Mary's conception of Christ as the Word of God incarnate. This is an uncommon, though not solitary, example of this imagery in early Italian portrayals of the Virgin and Child enthroned, as it normally accompanies a Virgin Annunciate and 14th century Tuscan depictions of the expectant version, as seen in the right example by Merovicione. The extensive use of gold in the Hodegetria iconography of the Barber triptych reflect the reception of Byzantine precedents in early Italian painting. Certain aspects of the Barber composition, however, are characteristic of Italian art. The thin, transparent veil worn by the Virgin beneath her headdress and the brooch that holds this garment together below her neck are both foreign to Byzantine depictions of the Madonna. The large and sturdy appearance of the Virgin and Child are reminiscent of Giotto's characteristically bulky figures, while the delicate folds of Gabriel, John the Baptist, and Christ embody elegant Gothic forms. The angling of John the Baptist towards the central panel is also a notable departure from Byzantine iconography, in which figures are depicted frontally as seen on the right Byzantine example. Furthermore, the depiction of Mary Magdalene as a penitent hermit recalls a medieval legendary tradition not prevalent beyond Western Europe, in which the Magdalene lived alone in the French wilderness in complete devotion to God. As noted in the first presentation, this legend stems from the late medieval conflation with Mary of Egypt, an early Christian Eremitic saint who lived in the desert. Depictions of the long-haired, ascetic Magdalene nonetheless became the standard imagery for this saint in the West. The reverse of the Barber triptych provides key insight into the original use of this object. Two figures, one on the reverse of each shutter, are visible, along with traces of painted red text originally meant to identify these figures. The reverse on the left shutter features a man in a black robe with white around the neckline. His tonsure, or the hairstyle ring of hair around the head, indicates his affiliation with a religious order. In fact, the design and color scheme of his robe closely resembles those worn by Dominican friars as seen in Fra Angelico's famous depiction of them. Unfortunately, the red inscription, called a titulus, above this figure has deteriorated beyond legibility. We do know that he is not St. Dominic, however, thanks to his lack of halo. The presence of this figure in the Dominican habit, or the clothing of religious orders, suggests that the original owner of the Barber triptych was either a member of the Dominican order or at least affiliated with it to some degree, as members of religious orders frequently appear in this period as the supplicants or donors in the artworks they commissioned. A Dominican owner would certainly appreciate the iconography of St. John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene on the front of the Barber triptych, as these saints were both known for their ascetic lives, pious devotion, and abandonment of worldly pleasures. The triptych was clearly used often, as evidenced by the deteriorated condition of the reverse. As discussed in our previous presentation, the small size and lightness of our triptych suggests that it was a portable object. A woman in red and black garments occupies the reverse of the right shutter. Her halo here confirms that she is a saint. Unlike the titulus above the Dominican friar, these letters are legible under MAXRF. They appear to read EL, Z, or S, A, B, E, T in Gothic script, which perhaps identifies her as St. Elizabeth, mother of John the Baptist. The attributes of St. Elizabeth of Hungary are noticeably absent, and St. Elizabeth of Portugal was not canonized until 1626. Depictions of the mother of John as a standalone figure are uncommon, as she normally appears in images of the visitation or the birth and naming of John the Baptist.
One of the most exciting findings of this project concerns the reverse of the two side panels. During initial examination, I observed a series of small white dots that appeared in corresponding locations on both panels. For discussions with Spencer and our tutors, we considered it unlikely that the reverse would originally have consisted only of the two saints against a plain background. Instead, we hypothesized that additional decorative elements may once have been present. This observation is also related to one of our key research questions: whether the front and back of the panels were executed at the same time and using similar techniques. To investigate this, samples were taken from both reverse panels. Cross-sectional analysis indicated that the green background was composed of a mixture of green and yellow pigments. The samples also revealed a preparation structure similar to that observed on the front of the painting, consisting of a substantial gesso brown followed by relatively thin paint layers. A sample taken from the robe of the female saint demonstrated that the green background was applied first, with the figure painted on top. These samples were subsequently analyzed using scanning electron microscopy, or SEM. SEM uses a focused beam of electrons to scan the surface of a sample, producing highly magnified images and allowing elemental analysis through the detection of characteristic X-rays. Like MAXRF, SEM can generate elemental maps, but at a much smaller scale and with greater spatial resolution. In the sample from the female saint, the green-yellow underlayer showed the presence of both copper and arsenic. This combination suggests the use of a copper-based green pigment mixed with orpiment. The blue row also contained copper, indicating the use of a copper-containing pigment. This differs from the materials identified on the front of the painting, where ultramarine appears to have been used instead. Despite these differences in pigment choice, the painting technique appears very similar, with fine brushwork characteristic of egg-tempera painting. The discovery of possible decorative remnants prompted us to carry out MAXRF imaging on the reverse of the panels. The results revealed evidence of a much more elaborate decorative scheme than is visible today. The white dots observed during examination corresponded to surviving fragments of painted decoration, and the elemental maps suggest the presence of at least two distinct cross motifs. The first cross, visible particularly in the arsenic and lead maps, appears relatively simple in design. The second, most clearly visible in the barium map, seems more elaborate. Unfortunately, the repaired split in the Mary Magdalene panel obscures part of this decoration, making its original appearance difficult to reconstruct. However, traces on either side of the repair suggest that a corresponding motif may have existed in both panels. The presence of barium is particularly interesting. Barium is not associated with pigments that would be expected in a 14th century Italian painting, and is more commonly linked to restoration materials used from the 19th century onwards. One possible interpretation is that this second decorative campaign postdates the original painting and may represent a later intervention. Because the split repair obscures portions of the barium-rich decoration, it is possible that the decoration predates the repair, meaning the panel was already decorated when the split occurred or when it was subsequently repaired. This interpretation is supported by the zinc map, which shows zinc concentrated along the repaired split. When considered alongside the conservation campaigns identified on the front of the painting, the evidence suggests that the current repair may belong to the zinc-based restoration campaign, which likely occurred after 1964. Sorry. If correct, this would help place the repair within the broader conservation history of the object and provide a relative chronology for the interventions observed on both the front and reverse surfaces.
These large painted crosses that once accompanied the Dominican friar and St. Elizabeth on each shutter show a similar floral motif which appears on the reverse of a Byzantine triptych shutter in the State Hermitage Museum, which one scholar identifies as the iconography of the Living Cross. The motif is not particularly prominent on the Barber triptych, however, and the lack of comparative examples makes it difficult to link this iconography to the Barber shutters. Crosses were nonetheless common on the reverses of painted and sculpted triptychs from Byzantium and late medieval Italy, though plain painted surfaces, imitation porphyry, geometric motifs, and standing saints dominated Italian shutters from the 14th century onwards. As for the dating and attribution of the Barber triptych, the blend of Byzantine, Giottesque, and Gothic elements present in the work are consistent with the late medieval Venetian school. Trecento Venice was an important commercial link between Byzantium and Western Europe, particularly after the sack of Constantinople in 1204, and the subsequent influx of Byzantine art into Italy. As for Tuscan influence, Giotto's famed Arena Chapel frescoes were a nearby Padua after 1305. Venice's principal Trecento painter was Paolo Veneziano, whose work blended Byzantine iconographies with Tuscan and Northern European Gothic elements. The pose, garments, and scroll of John the Baptist in the Barber triptych, as seen here, are quite similar to those of John in two triptychs by Paolo, which also situate the standing saint on a green surface, which are the two directly to the right of our example. It is more likely, however, that the Barber triptych was the product of a follower of Paolo Veneziano, as the more delicate rendering of garments and color correspond to the generation of Venetian artists in Paolo's wake. Among these are Paolo's son, Marco di Paolo Veneziano, and several others whose oeuvres have yet to be firmly reconstructed. The softer colors and folds of John in the Barber triptych are more consistent with those of this saint in triptychs by unknown Venetian artists of the late Trecento, as seen in the two examples on the far right. A fragmented triptych, Non Vicenza, even features similar punch marks in the gilding, which form two parallel horizontal lines that separate each of the standing figures, a feature also present in the Barber wings. It is therefore likely that the Barber triptych was made by an artist working in the generation after Paolo Veneziano in the last third of the 14th century. While it might be possible to someday attribute the Barber triptych to a specific artist, the current evidence is inconclusive.
This project has highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration when approaching artworks. Throughout our research, we have realized that our individual findings feed into each other's research and understanding of our object. Spencer's provenance research proved key in helping me discern conservation campaigns, which is important when making treatment decisions and understanding the painting matrix. It helped me inform what I was seeing under the microscope better as well. His findings also prompted me to undertake further analysis, such as MASRF on the front of the panel, and in turn, comparison with archival photograph helped comprehend the results better.
Daniela's analysis, especially on the back of the panel, was central in better understanding the original function and origin of our object. Analysis helped add to the art historical understanding of the object by providing a more conclusive identity for the female saint, now believed to be Saint Elizabeth, mother of John the Baptist. This, alongside the past decorations of the panels, was information which had not been previously recorded. Our research has also opened up new avenues for uncovering the original ownership of the Barber triptych, particularly in its relation to the Dominican order and their prominent presence in Venice in the Trecento at the Church of Saints Giovanni and Paolo. Furthermore, our findings identify with further confidence the Barber triptych as a product of Trecento, Venice, as seen in the stylistic comparison with other works from this period in place. And our references. Thank you for your time. We'd be happy to take any questions. Yes?
Can I ask about the figure of Mary Magdalene?
Sure.
How unusual is that iconography? Can you tell me more about it?
On the front of the right shutter, that's the Hermetic iconography of her in body length hair. So that attests to the medieval legend, which itself is a variety of different sources, but where she lived the last years of her life in the south of France, and she lived as a hermit in devotion to God without worldly possessions. And Jacobus of Origine in the Golden Legend recounts that every so often Mary would be ascended to heaven by angels, and that's how she would receive her sustenance. So that specific iconography relates to that story.
But are there pictorial antecedents that you can point to?
Yes, yeah, especially in Western iconography, that image goes, I mean, there's examples that go back to the 10th and 11th century, both in Tuscany and in Venice. But it's a Western iconography of that depiction of the penitent Magdalene living in the desert.
Did you scan the picture with infrared reflectography, and did you observe anything about the underdrawing?
Oh, yes, we couldn't really, there was no visible underdrawing, and that, I'll show you. So the yellow, kind of here, you can see that, there. Like those yellow bits, that's where basically what we saw was a difference in the robe of the Virgin. They were very, some were darker and some were lighter, and that corresponds to the blue and like the different blues used in their reflection. Okay.
Yes.
In your previous talk, you mentioned wanting to look a little bit more at the punchwork and the kind of explore the provenance of the punchwork. I was wondering whether you'd been able to do that or find anything out from
Right,
analysis there.
yes, so that was one of our objectives from the first presentation. The closest comparative example that I could find were those two, I believe it was the fragmented wing and the one on the last slide where you had John the Baptist and then the angel Gabriel above. It was a very unique arrangement of the design where there were two horizontal lines that separate each of the standing figures within the same panel. That was the only other comparative example I could find that uses it as it does in the Barber triptych. But comparing it to other examples of punchwork throughout this period, some of them, particularly in the workshops of leading artists, are very complex, very elaborate designs, whereas ours, you can see there's it would be a stylus that traces the circle of the halo, and then the punches would just go around the circle. And under close observation, it's a 4 or 5 pointed star. This is sort of it's a simple punch mark, but some of them in that period can be very elaborate, like in Paolo Veneziano in this workshop. Yes.
Another and you might have responded to it already, but from sort of like what you saw in the technical analysis, could you tell what damage was based on use and what damage was based on decay or the wrong kind of like keeping? Especially wondering, this is a small sort of like devotional piece. Did you touch on a particular way to kiss it? Is there a particular reason that the hand was sort of like had to be redone? Did they engage with that in a particular way?
Maybe most of the most of the evidence I saw was due to the pigments, but it is very heavily retouched. So the hand has some losses down to the ground, which yes might be due to someone touching it and sort of taking off the piece of the ground, but it might also be like it fell or the ground just failed. There is in Mary's face, there's one that's just straight through Mary's face, which might also be related to that. But something so specific is like there's one specific area where the gilding is more degraded. That's not, I couldn't see any evidence of it. What we could see though is that the two side panels are better conserved than the backs of the two side panels are better conserved than the back of the central panel, which does kind of point to the backs of the central panel being used as devotional, and the back was less carried off because it doesn't have any motifs in it.
If you compare our triptychs to some other ones, even within Palo Veneziano's, some of them are flawless on the backs, which could be a result of later restorations, but also a result of certain works being portable and used and others not. But as far as contact and touching with the front, there's the Duccio in the Metropolitan Museum that has the candle burns on the bottom, so it was before an altar, and you can see the burnt wood. We don't have that in our case as much, but it was, there are examples where there's evidence of direct interaction and touching, just based on the condition of the
And
material.
there are at least two different hinging systems still in. So there's one that we think is the first one, and then there's one that is a little bit later, but the painting wasn't hinged at the barber. So that might also point to the hinging being repaired and then used again so that you could continue opening it.
Great. Well, thank you again for all of your time.
So, hi, I'm Esther Hughes, and I'm an art history MA student at the Courtauld.
And I'm Finn McGrath, and I'm a conservator conservation student.
Before we begin, we'd like to just say a few thank yous to everyone who's assisted us in our research. So thank you to Rebecca and Jocelyn at Harewood House, to Becca and Alice at the National Trust, to Gianmarco at Sapienza, and Francis at the Stone Museum for all of their fascinating insights. And thank you to Pippa, Maureen and Karen at the Courtauld, and Diego, Leila and Alice at the Research Forum for all of your help.
We'd just like to begin this presentation by reintroducing the object of this project, which is a grisaille painting by the Venetian painter Antonio Zucchi, who came to London in 1766 to work as a decorative painter for the Adams Architectural Office. And after working for James Adam, he did this after working for James Adam on his Grand Tour. The painting is datable from 1766 to 1771, when Robert Adam was producing designs for Harewood House, a stately home in Yorkshire, which this painting was part of the dining room decorative scheme for. It was originally set directly into the wall and intended to imitate this kind of plaster relief. And to do this, Zucchi employed the painting technique of grisaille, which means he painted in a very limited palette of greys. It depicts Bacchus, Ceres, and Venus, Roman gods of agriculture, wine, and love. These are typical themes for a neoclassical dining room, as was the fashion at the time. And during 19th century renovations of Harewood House, the original Adams interior of the dining room was altered, and all of the wall integrated paintings, such as this one, by Zucchi were removed. So the presentation is going to outline our findings for each of the research questions which we set out in our January presentation, which are namely attribution and artistic agency, why the grisaille technique, historical audiences, and questions regarding display and redisplay. Our visit to Harewood House in February emphasized the highly integrated nature of the Adam interior, in which furnishings, decorative detail, color scheme, and iconographic program are all in dialogue with one another. This impressed upon us the inseparability of the painting from its decorative interior, and with this in mind, we sort of reoriented some of our research questions regarding display and redisplay, focusing more on the painting within its original decorative scheme. This in turn has had some implications for the painting's conservation treatment and potential redisplay. So, Esther will begin our research questions.
So our first research question concerned securing the attribution of the painting to Antonio Zucchi, as well as assessing the level of his artistic independence within the Adam Architectural Office. And this was really important for us to ascertain, given that Robert Adam famously had very tight control over the craftsmen working within his architectural office, often very closely supervising almost every aspect of the designs. And as a result, multiple craftsmen left his office after a single term of employment, complaining of restrictive employment practices. Nonetheless, fine artists, including decorative painters, held an exceptional position within this practice, and Zucchi is a very good example of that, given that he came to the UK with already an established artistic reputation. He'd undertaken high status commissions in Venice, he had a classical education, and as soon as arriving in England, he joined multiple artistic and intellectual circles in London and became an Associate Royal Academician in 1770, which shows that he had this very established artistic reputation outside of the Adam office. So by tracing the journey of the painting from its original conception to its installation in Harewood House, we were able to ascertain the kind of nature of Zucchi's artistic autonomy within this creative process. So in terms of his preparatory process, we located this sketchbook attributed to Zucchi at the Huntington Museum, and you're able to see his kind of process of developing his compositions. You can see fairly rough, sketchy pencil sketches where he's starting to develop the figural compositions up to more finished pen drawings. And this pen drawing in particular we found had a very close composition to our painting, which suggests that he developed the composition to a high level before copying it onto canvas.
And after he would do this kind of preliminary compositional process, he would then prime painting with a ground layer. And through microscopy and the subsequent micrograph images here, we can see that the painting's been painted with a double yellow chalk ground, which is very much in line with 18th century English priming convention. Kind of interesting to think about from a Venetian painter, from a Venetian tradition. And this is most likely the preference requested by Robert Adam, who we know from archival letters wanted to produce a harmony of toned ground colors across his interiors, and he would use it for the plasterwork, stucco, paintings, and even the wall colors. However, what we were able to notice is that the canvas that the artist chose to use for the painting shows an Italian style of canvas, Italianate characteristics. And the conservation literature sort of suggests that at this time, Italianate canvases would have been more open weave linen, open plain weave linen, and which is what this painting uses. So Zucchi then either sought out the painting's primary support himself or brought it back from Italy when he went. And the X-ray that we see on the screen here just helps us visualize the internal fabric of the painting, so we can see the weaves a little bit more clearly beneath its very heavily painted lead white opaque paint layers. We also uncovered archived letters which revealed that Zucchi then would, once completing the painting, would then deliver his paintings to the White Bear Inn in Piccadilly, which served as a coach station, and from here they were delivered up to Yorkshire. This, however, is a note in the payment book that we found at the Harewood House Archives, which records a 1771 payment to a John Wood, a local carpenter, for making stretching frames for the pictures in the staircase and the dining room. So material evidence supports this suggestion that the canvas was re-stretched on arrival, as the current strainer appears to be constructed from off-cut pieces of timber, and this is the verso of the painting just there. And essentially this material journey can trace the conception of Zucchi's decorative works created within the Adams remit. Zucchi was not an artist waiting for independence. He came to the office already formed. He had his own iconographic repertoire, intellectual networks, and clearly materials. Whilst following the framework and various conditions set by Robert Adams, Zucchi also operated as an independent creative mind, likely offering up compositions and subject matter that he had come up with himself.
So our next stage in our research was to reconstruct the decorative interior that the painting had been part of. Given the highly integrated nature of Adams' schemes, we thought this was very important. So we used archival evidence and surviving objects from the Harewood House dining room to create a sense of the interior that the painting was part of. So we started with Robert Adams' design for the dining room, which shows fairly minimal decoration by the Robert Adams standard. It has this recessed apse as the focal point of the room, and the large part of the decorative detail is constituted by this band of roundels and painted panels that punctuate the upper register of the wall. We've managed to identify the subjects of all of these paintings by cross-referencing a tourist companion to Harewood House from 1819 that attributes them to Zucchi, with surviving paintings in the Harewood archive. So the subjects of these paintings would be the four seasons, which were each of those small four roundels, a Grecian dance, the binding of Bacchus with ivy bands, the rape of Helena, and a festival of Bacchus, which is our painting. So this attests to a classical iconography linked with feasting, abundance, and the natural world, which was very fitting for a neoclassical dining room. And these would have all been framed in gilded frames. The room was furnished by a Chippendale set made out of incredibly expensive mahogany, imported from British colonies. The chairs and sofas of the set were upholstered in red leather, and gold accents complement the set, which also we can see kind of would have complemented the frames of the Zucchi paintings. And as well as this, the ornament of the furniture set has this Bacchic theme with the satyrs' heads, the bulls' heads, and the garlands, showing how the furnishings are kind of in dialogue with the iconographic program of the paintings. An inventory from 1795 shows that the room also had a sage green carpet and crimson damask window curtains, which also would have matched with the red upholstery of the Chippendale set. So again, we can see a highly integrated interior design. We were not able to find a record of the wall colour of the interior. However, by looking at other Robert Adam dining rooms from the 1760s, we were able to ascertain that it was likely a fairly neutral and restrained colour, kind of a grey or a muted kind of blue or brown. So from all of this information, we created a speculative AI reconstruction of the interior. Now, of course, this can only offer a very general impression of how it might have looked. However, I think it's important to show because it stresses the central point that this painting did not exist in isolation, and it was part of this kind of dialogue between architectural interior, decorative ornament, furnishings, and our following research questions all centered around the painting as part of this highly integrated decorative scheme.
And that kind of leads into this question of why Versailles. And as Esther just illustrated, understanding Zucchi's painting within this broader decorative context really clarifies the significance of the decision to execute the series in a grisaille, with the explicit aim of imitating a sculpted stone frieze. And just to reiterate, a grisaille is a monochrome painting which in which form is articulated primarily through variations of tone and shade. During conservation, successive phases of surface cleaning have not only brightened the composition, but also revealed Zucchi's intended tonality more clearly. Whereas the painting initially appeared to have a soft, undifferentiated grey palette, cleaning has uncovered 3, even 4 distinct colour zones: a warm yellow in the foreground, a cooler blue-grey in the back, and a yellow-brown-green range used for the central figures. Although the work still does read broadly as neutral, the subtle differences in shade do accentuate the intention and skill of Zucchi in rendering the grisaille and imitating chalet plaster relief. These micrographs illustrate the efficacy of cleaning in some areas. Just an example of that. The use of grisaille to mimic sculptural friezes became increasingly more common in neoclassical decorative schemes, particularly as 18th century archaeological excavations in Greece and Italy popularized ancient sculptures to the English class, the English aristocratic class. So this evocation of antique relief carving had particular resonance in the dining room. Robert Adam himself stressed that the decoration of the dining room should reflect its social function. In England, men traditionally remained at the table after dinner for political conversation and drinking, merrymaking, while the women withdrew to the drawing room for tea. As a key site of male sociability, the dining room was to be richly decorated, but in a different manner from softer, more textile-laden interiors. This is to sometimes avoid the retention of food odors. Adam favoured durable surfaces, that is stucco, painting and sculpture, over heavy fabrics. In 18th century Britain, antique sculpture carried a particular cultural authority as the most complete expression of classic artistic achievement, as well as the embodiment of an ideal of Roman civic virtue. Therefore, aristocratic British men were compelled to reproduce and translate the visual culture of ancient Rome and Greece on the Grand Tour, bringing home engravings, plaster casts, drawings of ancient sculptures, and monuments to adorn their stately homes. Zucchi had been directly involved in this process, accompanying James Adam on his Grand Tour and producing many images of Italy's archaeological sites, as we can see on the slide here. He would have been thus intimately familiar with the processes of material translation that define England's interaction with classical antiquity, as well as the cultural authority conferred to these representations. Within this framework, the dining room's masculine and political charged function made it a natural setting for the visual language of classical sculpture, as seen in Adam interiors such as Lansdowne House here on the left and Scion on the right, which adopt a classical sculpture gallery scheme. Zucchi's use of grisaille to imitate sculptural frieze should then be understood as a direct response to both the social function of the room, calling on the cultural authority of antiquity to reinforce this elite intellectual status of the space.
So going on from this, we thought it was important to also introduce the patron who ordered the construction of Harewood House, thus also the patron of Robert Adam and Antonio Zucchi. This is Edwin Lascelles, and the history of the Lascelles family is really illuminating to help us understand the context of the painting. So the Lascelles family had been originally relatively humble farming gentry until the early 18th century, when Henry Lascelles, who's the father of Edwin, became involved in the sugar trade and British colonial commerce. Henry had very wide-ranging business involvements, from supplying the Royal Navy in the Caribbean to transporting enslaved people across the Atlantic and money lending and mortgaging Caribbean plantation owners. So you can see he's involved on multiple levels across multiple different enterprises, which made him one of the wealthiest men in Britain by the time of his death in 1753. So Edwin inherited a vast amount of money, part of which went into the construction of Harewood House. So here we can see a very serious move from the Lascelles family to convert this colonial commercial wealth into social status and political power based on land ownership and stately home. And there was a degree of success in this because Edwin Lascelles was made Baron Harewood in 1790. And we can clearly see that Edwin Lascelles very much understood the importance of arts to really consolidate his social status, given that he commissioned Robert Adam to do his interiors, Thomas Chippendale to do his furnishings. This was the most expensive commission that Chippendale carried out throughout his career, and Lancelot Capability Brown to do the gardens. So all the kind of big names of the second half of the 18th century. And, excuse me, the dining room emerges as the kind of central social space within this magnificent estate, as we've seen. And an 1819 tourist companion gives a really nice example of how it was actually used. So it records the visit of the Grand Duke Nicholas of Russia in 1816. He kind of occupies various rooms of this interior, but ends up in the dining room. And I quote, "The costly service of gold plate was in use, and the whole arrangements were of the most splendid and even princely description, but with entire regard to true old English hospitality." And I'd like to draw attention to the word princely there, the idea that this kind of material wealth that had been put on show in the dining room could translate to this idea of political status is very significant. And the painting within this scheme would have appealed to the classical education of these aristocratic men who would have been guests to Harewood House. In particular, our composition, which shows Bacchus, Ceres, and Venus. As we discussed in our January presentation, this isn't just a representation of Roman gods, but it actually refers to an ancient Latin adage that reads, "Without Ceres and Bacchus, Venus freezes," or in other words, "Without food and wine, love grows cold." So this is a kind of coded classical reference embedded within the decorative program that aristocratic men would have been kind of conditioned to decipher. So the painting kind of functions as this point of dialogue between these wealthy men and their patron and the patron of the scheme to kind of display classical education and kind of social status. So that therefore shows how the neoclassical idiom of the painting played actually a key role in kind of channeling this wealth amassed through colonial commerce into a clear display of cultivated taste, intellectual authority, and aristocratic distinction. So to conclude, our project has shown that Zucchi's Bacchus, Ceres, and Venus cannot be understood in isolation, but as part of an integrated Adam interior shaped by classicism, elite masculine sociability, and wealth derived from British colonial commerce. The painting's material structure and grisaille technique reveal Zucchi as an independent, intellectually engaged artist working within and sometimes beyond the constraints of the Adam office. At the same time, its original setting in the Harewood dining room embedded it in a decorative program that actively legitimized the Lascelles family colonial fortunes. The question now under consideration regarding conservation is where the appropriate cleaning endpoint lies for this painting within its wider decorative and historical context, and how best to balance aesthetic improvement with preservation of traces of age, use, and destruction that testify to its complex material history within this ensemble of decorative painting. Our reconstruction of the interior scheme may offer potential inspiration for redisplay, but it also underlines the limitations of such an undertaking, which must be acknowledged as speculative and considered as apart from the original context. Thank you. Now if anyone has questions.
I've got a question. It was interesting that you said that when you cleaned the painting, there were different passages of coloured areas. There was a blue area and a yellowish area and so on. I was wondering, could you speak a little bit more about the painting technique for grisaille? Is it actually black and white, or were there coloured pigments perhaps used in the areas?
Actually, that's a good question, and Esther and I were having a discussion yesterday about that exact thing, because as we were presented with the painting, it was very grey, very, very grey. So it was very obviously, oh yeah, this is a grisaille. It's just painted in like, black and white pigments, potentially a bit of umber, whatever. But yeah, as you say, as I was cleaning, different colours seemed to kind of come through, which are, doing justice to his rendering of the composition and artistic capabilities. But yeah, we had this discussion yesterday, and we're talking about maybe it's more, could be more characterized as a cameo, right? You know, which is a similar to a grisaille, but it usually uses just a limited range of tones to complete another imitated relief painting. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, not really. No, I wondered whether there were coloured pigments used, not
Yes,
just black
I
and
see what you're
white.
saying. Yes,
Yeah.
there's indication of yellow earth, especially, which you can see in the cross sections quite vividly. That's the main one that you can see. There's definitely some black. There's some blues as well. Very, very small pigment particles of blue in the background. So it's definitely shows that.
And that was great, Vanessa. That's, yeah, really interesting. I was really intrigued about the reference to John Wood, the local carpenter, obviously making the stretcher for the painting. And I was just, he's quite important in Harewood's history because he was also essentially acting as a freelancer for people like Chippendale as well. So he was doing quite a lot. I was just wondering whether that's something that's common with other like Zuki schemes and Adam schemes, whether if they were using, you know, local craftspeople to stretch paintings once they've arrived on site. Is that a common thing, or?
We haven't seen extensive evidence of it, but we know that a lot of the time these paintings would undertake quite long journeys. Like the coach station that we mentioned, the White Bear Inn in Piccadilly, was also where his paintings were transported to Nostell Priory, which is also in Yorkshire. So if this was a kind of method of transportation of the painting to kind of take it off its stretcher, transport just the canvas, and then re-hang it once it had arrived in whatever stately home it was arriving at, this could point to like similar, you know, technique in other examples, and it would definitely be something interesting to look more into.
I think there was that letter from Adam about Nostell Priory, if you remember, and he was reassuring, who was it that Nostell Priory at the time?
Roland Wynne.
Roland Wynne. He was reassuring Wynne about the that the paintings would be put up well, whatever that meant. For that, so that could be, you know, stretching or putting it up in the frames, but so it alluded to that kind of thing. But that was the process. Yeah.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. That's amazing work, you two. I had a question, but sort of building on Aviva's, with the discovery of the new pigments. You referred to these as plaster relief sculptures, but could that discovery of pigments change the relief substance that you think Zuki was imitating? So could it be terracotta or something, not like the burnt red terracotta we think of when we think of, but you know, if you think of like Clodion or someone like that, instead of a grayer terracotta.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it gives more indication to what he was trying to achieve with the room broadly, the color of the wall, how the painting would sit in, you know, kind of in the wall and next to probably a relative, you know, not just a white, it would have been a color of substance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of stone as well. Like if you think about the materials that many of these antiquities that they were seeing on the Grand Tour were crafted from, plaster was more just the kind of imitations that they would use, obviously, to bring these back. But I guess the use of these kind of diverse pigments shows he's also not just referring to the imitations of the reliefs, but actually the originals, which could have been stone.
Yeah.
It kind of, your discovery kind of in a way ennobles the reliefs.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. That's a good point.
I know you mentioned that these panels were sort of removed in like the redecoration of the dining room. What sort of happened after it was taken off? Were they just put in storage and left there for like decades and centuries? And are there other surviving panel examples as well?
So all of the works still exist.
Okay.
Some in better condition than others, but currently all of them are in storage, apart from this one, which is at the Courtauld. Yeah.
And there was a kind of Victorian plasterwork decorative scheme that was put in the place of where the paintings originally were, which is what's in the dining room now.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Juliana. I'm the MA History of Art student. And I'm Katie. I'm the student doing the conservation work.
Okay, louder, you two.
Sorry. So today we want to talk about a privately owned crucifixion by an unknown artist from the 19th century. Yeah. So as you can see, our object is a small-scale devotional painting on tin. It depicts Christ on the cross flanked by two figures, which are the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist. They stand beneath the decorated cross with gilded floor ornaments framed by a red curtain, which creates a bit of a sense of revelation or staging composition. We have an inscription which is below the scene, and it identifies the Christ as the miraculous Christ of Esquipulas, which is a miracle-working image venerated in the town of Esquipulas in Guatemala. The original shrine was carved, sculpture of the shrine, was carved in 1595 by Quirio Catano, a Portuguese artist who did this sculpture, which became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Central America. Pilgrims here traveled from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and eventually from Mexico. The shrine is famous for its miraculous healings, and by the 18th century, devotion had expanded far beyond Guatemala itself, and it allowed the image to appear in countless copies and reproductions across Central America. And our research questions, so what immediately struck us about this painting was how unusual it is. Although the image is rich in details regarding the symbolism and its historical context, because it comes from a private collection without provenance, attribution, or a precise date, we think it's a very interesting object that we wanted to reconstruct its context. We wanted to use the evidence of the painting itself. So its materials, its iconography, its style, its technical structure, and its condition. We kind of hope to better understand not just what the painting represents, because that's kind of like a bit obvious, but we wanted to see how it had been produced, how it functioned, and who it might have been intended for. So our investigation ultimately kind of centered where was the object made, when was it made, and who was it made for.
Okay, so looking at the treatment thus far, we can stay. Okay. I was able to finish the consolidation using the synthetic resin Parallel B72, concentrating on the most vulnerable areas of flaking, which can be seen here in blue. After unframing, I gently cleaned the front and the back surfaces using a soft bristle brush to remove any loose surface dirt or dust. The back of the artwork was in a more advanced state of corrosion and looks to have never been painted, showing how much that the paint layer has likely contributed to shielding the support from moisture and ingress. The back was coated in a layer of B72 as well to prevent further degradation while the painting is being treated. After that, this object was able to be handled, which allowed for proper photography, documentation, and the continuation of our technical analysis, which, along with the art historical research conducted by Juliana, helped us to begin to unpack some of our research questions. So several visual and material features pointed towards a possible Mexican context. The tin support, the painting's scale and portability, and its relationship to the broader tradition of 19th century Mexican devotional painting. Regarding the support, beginning in the 1920s, the use of tin plate as a substrate for santo painting became increasingly popular in the more wealthy and populous states of western Mexico, including Jalisco, Guanajuato, and San Luis Potosi. Most of this tin was imported from Britain, as in the 18th century, British metallurgists developed a new technique of bonding tin leaf to iron sheets. As the manufacture of tin plate did not begin in Mexico until 1947, virtually all early santos were painted on sheets imported from Britain. These sheets came in standard sizes, which I have shown here, which were cut progressively in half to achieve a desired size. Many were quite small, but the most commonly seen sizes were 7 by 10 inches and 10 by 14 inch sheets. The miraculous Christ is just shy of this second measuring, sitting at 10 by 13 inches. Santos painted on tin plate were produced in abundance from the 1820s to the 1920s, when they began to be replaced by cheap lithographs depicting religious imagery, although the highest concentrations were from between the years of 1850 to 1900. Originally only able to be commissioned by more wealthy patrons, the use of tin plate made them much more affordable and increased their accessibility for the middle class. The lightweight materials also meant that they were much more portable.
The support, however, is not the only reason we began considering a Mexican context for our painting, because it also shares a number of stylistic characteristics with other Mexican sample production. Many of this type of paintings, which are also called retablos, were produced outside major artistic centers in Mexico City or Puebla, where access to academically trained artists was more limited and the local devotional needs often took precedence over artistic innovation. Or other types of fashions. So while neoclassicism and later on romanticism dominated institutions such as the Academy of San Carlos in Mexico City, many devotional images continued to employ a visual language more rooted in the Baroque tradition. So rather than striving for naturalism, these works prioritized a bit of legibility and emotional immediacy and a bit of effectiveness. So figures were designed to be instantly recognizable through their attributes and more conventional iconography. And in our painting, for example, this can be seen by the dagger carried by the Virgin and her prayer position, which immediately identifies her as the Mater Dolorosa, or the Virgin of Sorrows, regardless of the viewer's literacy or education. The composition as well, it follows a convention established by Santo Production. So the Christ dominates the image through scale and placement, and he occupies the central vertical axis of the painting. By contrast, the Virgin and St. John are pushed more towards the lower side and are a bit more contained in their own visual spaces. This also creates the typical grand manner effect that artists achieve through drapery or furniture or gilded ornaments, which are all visible in the painting. So this guides the viewer's attention towards the crucified Christ and makes the identities of the devotional functions of each character in the scene immediately recognizable. Yet we're still puzzled as to why an object so embedded in Guatemalan culture in Guatemalan culture made it to 19th century Mexico. So we kind of explain how this happened. We found the answer in the Franciscans' role in the spread of the cult. So although the original sculpture remained in Guatemala, devotion to the image quickly expanded throughout Central America and New Spain. From the 16th century onwards, Franciscan missionaries established extensive religious networks connecting Guatemala, southern and central Mexico, and eventually the northern frontier of the US. And these networks facilitated not just the movement of people, but also the movement of different practices, stories, and images. And so as reports of miracles spread, the image acquired a reputation that extended far beyond the original shrine. And pilgrims carried with them stories of healings they had witnessed home, and the clergy also promoted devotion through sermons or feast days or confraternities, and in general just devotional imagery. The networks further disseminated the broader language used to depict the Christ, and in this case we can see it through the affective devotion and the emotional engagement characteristic of Franciscan images. And so although we cannot connect them directly to the production of our painting, we do believe that the Franciscans helped create the networks through which the cult traveled, which might explain the features in our painting, including the prominence of the Virgin of Sorrows, and St. John as well, but especially their youthful appearance and the emphasis on their grief and their witnessing within the composition. So our next question is about how the image itself may have traveled. So the case of the Santo Niño Atocha in Spain and then in New Spain helped us imagine the model through which our image might have made it from Guatemala to Mexico. So the story of El Santo Niño began as a miracle-working sculptural image venerated at a specific shrine, but by the 19th century, the same figure was appearing throughout Mexico on devotional prints, on painted retablos, on pilgrimage souvenirs, and paintings on tin, like our own. And production centers such as Zacatecas were creating these images in an almost industrial scale and distributed them across northern Mexico into what is now the southwestern United States, which provided us with a bit of a useful model for understanding how our own painting might have been produced. So the Santo Niño Tocha shows how a sacred image that originated in a sculpture could be produced and disseminated in a variety of different forms, and eventually reached devotees through portable devotional objects such as paintings on tin. Unlike the Santo Niño Tocha, our Christ of the Esquipulas originated as a miracle working sculpture that we encounter here in a small devotional painting. So we found a rich tradition of representation of the statue at the original shrine, which we can see here. Though we noticed that there was something very unusual in our own painting. So most of these surviving examples preserve the same orientation as the sculptural ensemble itself at the Guatemalan shrine. The relationship between the Christ and the accompanying figures corresponds with the arrangement seen in the statue. But in our painting, however, we see that it is inversed. And this immediately introduced a new variable into our investigation, which was print culture. During the Viceregal period, prints played an important role in disseminating devotional imagery throughout the Spanish world. They were also one of the principal sources used by retablo painters when constructing compositions. And because the printing process reverses an image, artists working directly from printed models would often reproduce the reversed composition exactly as they encountered it, as we can see in this example from a print that originated in, well, this is from Peru, but this originated in Rome and then traveled all the way to the Viceroyalty in Peru. And so the reversed arrangement in our painting raised the possibility that the artist may have not been working from direct observation of the shrine itself, but perhaps from an intermediary printed image. And so the hypothesis became even more convincing when we turned to the technical evidence that came in.
Okay, so once the painting had been unframed, we used the Courtauld Osiris imaging system to capture a much more high-resolution image of the crucifixion, and one that included the edges, which was not possible with the limited window of the VSC 8000. The resulting infrared reflectograph has given us a more complete idea of the underdrawing done in carbon-based material, which is beneath the paint layer, and there's significantly more of it than we originally thought. I have traced the lines in red here for easier visibility. Here are some close-ups of the figures of St. John and the Virgin. The artist has kept fairly faithfully to the underdrawn composition with a few changes to the figure of St. John around the hair and the hands, and it seems like he may have originally been meant to have a beard, looking at the curved loops beneath his chin. Largely, the underdrawing seems to only form the outlines of shapes. There's no evidence of shading or hatching to denote depth or volume. Folds in the drapery are marked only by a single line. These kind of blank shapes could indicate that the forms might have been made using stencils, with smaller details added later to suggest the placement of cuffs, necklines, folds, and other decorative elements. This method would allow for larger volumes of repeated imagery to be produced more effectively. Additionally, unpacking an artist's palette can also be hugely helpful in understanding the artistic practices common to a geographical area during a specific time period. Authors Jorge Durand and Douglas Massey describe the typical appearance of 19th century Mexican santos in their book Miracles on the Border. They note the use of clear reds, dark blues, and specifically the presence of chrome yellows, utilized alone or mixed with blue pigments to achieve greens. This discussion of the palette was corroborated by findings from the technical analysis conducted on the Miraculous Christ. A variety of pigments were found to be utilized by the artist. Carbon black, vermilion, lead white, and brown earth colors came from local sources and have been used throughout the pre-Columbian era and early colonial history as colorants. Additionally, a dark red lake pigment is present in the shadows of the red cloth. We weren't able to confirm the exact type. However, I think it is fairly likely that this lake is cochineal, because southern Mexico was one of the primary exporters of this pigment, along with Peru, between the 16th and 19th centuries because of the rich color and high quality of the material that was produced there. Prussian blue was also identified using Raman spectrometry, sorry, that's a hard word to say, a technique which can help identify a specific kind of structural fingerprint by which compounds can be identified. Introduced in the early 18th century, it became a staple for artists because it was a stable and less expensive alternative to other blue pigments such as ultramarine and azurite. The oldest documented record of this pigment in South America was from Peru in 1770, and we can assume that it spread rapidly across the Americas afterwards, as it was mentioned as being used commonly in retablos produced only a few decades later. X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, a technique which allows for the identification of inorganic materials, confirms the presence of chrome yellow, a pigment synthesized from chromite, which was discovered between 1804 and 1809. It became very popular in the second quarter of the 19th century, although it is not known exactly when this was introduced to Central America. Contemporary artists' handbooks mention that chrome yellow was a very expensive color, which was greatly extended with barite, gypsum, alumina, and lead sulfate, and sold under the commercial name Cologne yellow. Looking at the macro XRF false color maps, which visualize the distribution of an element across the composition, you can see that the signal for barium was also found in combination with the signals for chromium, indicating that the chrome yellow paint used by the artist was likely sold extended with barite or barium sulfate, sulfate, likely to make the materials more affordable. This extender in both its natural and synthetic form was widely introduced into commercially produced paints after 1820. And so while no single pigment can date this painting exactly, taken together, the evidence points to a painting likely created sometime after 1820 during the height of retablo painting in Mexico, which began to decline after 1900. However, investigating the palette did not immediately answer all of the questions that we had posed during our last talk regarding specific areas of the painting where it was difficult to determine whether certain phenomena were due to degradation or a part of the original composition. The first example of this was in the loincloth area, which, as you can see, has this dark layer on top. I took a small sample from a discrete area near a previous loss, and one of the original theories was that this might be some form of degradation that was pushing up from beneath the paint layer, but this cross-section shows that rather it is something distinct on the surface. The macro XRF false color maps show that both zinc and copper are present in the areas corresponding to the brown on the loincloth, but also to those on the yellow pedestal as well. One hypothesis is that brass, which is a metal alloy of zinc and copper, may be what we're seeing. Brass leaf rolled from a foil could be ground up and mixed with a mordant to form a kind of shell brass, which would likely give a glittering effect, and may have been used as an inexpensive alternative to shell gold. The book, pardon my pronunciation, La Técnica de la Pintura de Nueva España by Carrillo y Gariel documents the use of metallic gold in embellishments of drapery, halos, and crowns of saints during the later 18th century, noting that it is almost always the powder of the same metal mixed with a resinous varnish. Additionally, the loincloth and pedestal having a more metallic shine would also bring this imagery closer to that of the original statue in Esquipulas, as well as similar contemporary examples, like this one here that Juliana mentioned earlier. It is hard to explain why the signal is so patchy, and while the small area that's free from the shell brass is likely an old cleaning test, the signal still does not follow the edges of the loincloth or the pedestal exactly. A potential explanation is that the shell brass might have been applied in a very medium-rich glaze, so that the details of the loincloth could still be easily visible. Now that this medium has darkened significantly, it appears very different. Additionally, there was the question of the red underlayer, which was only seen in flakes originating from certain areas of the composition. A small sample taken from the yellow pedestal illustrates that the red layer is a distinct paint layer beneath two brown layers. rather than an interaction, again, between the paint and the substrate. Scanning electron microscopy coupled with energy dispersive X-rays, or SEM-EDX, an analytical technique that allows for the assessment of the elemental composition of materials within a small sample, confirmed the presence of both mercury and sulfur in the paint matrix, indicating that this red layer contained vermilion. Returning to the macro XRF false color maps, the scan for mercury, here I increased the contrast so that it was a little bit easier to see, show that mercury and therefore vermilion is likely present in areas of the composition where no red color is visible, including the edges of the curtains, the stage floor, and the clothing of the Virgin Mary. It's hard to tell why the artist applied this red paint and then decided to cover it all with 2 thin layers of lead-containing ground before repainting the image. It could be an initial sketch. However, there are many contemporary santos where Mary has red in her costume, but it is difficult to say.
So one of the most interesting findings from Katie's analysis, which she just discussed, was the possible presence of metallic embellishment in areas such as Christ's loincloth and the pedestal, which kind of prompted us to think how it might have been, our object might have been in use. So metallic paints, gilding, decorative textiles, and silver ornaments were all common features in Mexican visual culture, which kind of reflected the very prominent taste for ornamentation. And the likely presence of shell brass suggests that the parts of the painting that may have originally shimmered in candlelight enhanced its visual impact within a devotional setting. Another question raised by the technical analysis concerned the Virgin's costume. As Katie's scans revealed, mercury signals associated with vermilion appear in areas where there's no visible paint surviving. This suggests that the red pigments were originally present in parts of the composition where they are not immediately apparent today, which becomes particularly interesting finding when considering alongside traditional representations of both the Virgin Mary and St. John. In European and colonial iconographic traditions, both figures are frequently associated with red garments, but the presence of vermilion raises the questions about whether the color schemes of the composition may have been conceived differently originally. At the same time, however, the final appearance of the Virgin remains puzzling, but we theorized about this a little bit, taking the traditional red and blue combination and thinking about it more in the audience that it might have been displayed for. Mary is now prominently dressed in green, and while we cannot determine the artist's intentions with certainty, the color choice may most certainly be related to the resonance within a Mexican devotional context. So by the 19th century, the blue and green mantle of the Virgin of Guadalupe had become one of the most recognizable Marian images in Mexico. And while we cannot suggest with certainty that our painting represents the Virgin of Guadalupe, it is very possible that the Marian garments carried these associations would have been immediately familiar to a Mexican viewer. As well, thinking about the embellishment guided our theories on the puncture holes across the composition, which was perhaps something that puzzled us the most. So we can see 10 of them arranged in a remarkably regular and almost symmetrical pattern towards the middle, and an additional one located above Christ's crown. And throughout Mexico and across the Spanish world, sacred images were often treated as objects rather than simple pictures. Miracle working sculptures were dressed with textiles that were adorned with jewelry, with crowns, with flowers, and sometimes other type of metallic ornaments, as you can see in the image. In some cases, the paintings themselves could be embellished by attaching devotional objects, sequins, artificial flowers, and other kinds of paintings, which we discussed in our previous presentations, which are called ex votos. So they are paintings that pledge a specific miracle, and then they're attached to other santos like ours, and they just kind of like work together to ask for something specific. And this practice is particularly common in traditions surrounding cult images, where the boundary between representation and sacred image is a bit murky and blurred. And rather than merely depicting a figure, devotees often interacted physically with the image itself. And while we cannot determine exactly what was attached to our painting, the regular arrangement of the holes suggests an intentional modification rather than some sort of accidental damage, as we initially realized. And one possibility is that the painting was incorporated into a larger devotional display, and another is that decorative elements were once attached directly into its surface, and maybe at some point both of them at the same time. The isolated hole above Christ's crown is especially suggestive of this. It may have been supported by a small ornament, perhaps a metal crown, or a decorative jewel, or a milagro, which is a charm image, or just some other type of devotional attachment intended to enhance the image and make it a bit more sparkly under the light. And although these possibilities remain speculative, they encourage us to think how the painting was not just an image, but rather an object in use that interacted closely with whoever owned it at some point.
So this research has contributed greatly to an understanding of this work and its context, and kind of unpicking the layer structures and understanding more about what is degradation and what is original material has helped shape future conservation considerations for the painting going forward, particularly in the presentation of the final image, and how things like the framing will help protect the artwork, which is also a decorative object that once had a profound functional and religious use. Thank you. And
Hi, that was fascinating. Could you say a little more, do you know any more about the trade of tin plates? You mentioned that they were coming from Britain. Is that tin mined in Cornwall? And do you have any kind of documentary evidence of how that trade worked? Was it just in the 20th century, or was it 19th as well? Or how does it relate to your tin plate?
it started in the early to mid 18th century, I believe. Like, I know that Britain had a lot of tin mines. I'm not sure exactly where the tin was coming from. From Cornwall. Okay, thanks. Additionally, I think that technology also moved pretty soon after to America as well, and I know that they were also producing some tin plate there. I'm not sure the direct trade routes that those were taking.
Yeah, we're very unsure about where our tin might have originated, but probably like at some point in the US, since it's that like network culture that we're like looking at, like that's probably likely from either the US or
Britain. Yeah. Yes, Suzanne.
Brilliant presentation, really. And when you started in January, presentation that you made then has really, the leap forward is extraordinary. So I have a question about those really exciting things you have found about the holes, the regularity of the holes and what would have been there. It's not accidental, in other words. And that those additional votive images would have been enhancing the sort of power of the image. So given that, is it possible to think that choice of painting on tin was very much intentional as well? In other words, putting these other pieces in there would work well if it is on tin, and you probably hammer it in, right? So are there paintings in other media that would represent this? And if not, then is the choice of the tin, not only for mobility of it, but also for these sort of malleable use of the tin painting, could that be part of the discussion?
I think to some extent they kind of like go together, like the fact that it's such an accessible material and the type of relationship that whoever owned the painting would have had with it kind of like goes in hand. So the explotos, which are the kind of votive paintings that were being attached to it, they also were made in tin. So they were also easily accessible. They could be homemade even, not necessarily commissioned. So I think it goes a bit hand in hand. The material lends itself to be handled however whoever owned it would have done it, because they have such a close relationship with these kinds of objects. It's just kind of like reciprocal in that sense.
So did you find anything more about the symbolism behind the various little charms?
What does a hanging leg mean?
So, because the Christ of Esquipulas is a healing image, of healing power. So if you have your foot aches, what do you do?
Broken leg.
The broken leg. You get a charm of a foot, just stick it, and a couple of weeks you'll be all fine, hopefully. So that's how it works.
That's fascinating.
Really good. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toby Matinde. I'm currently a master's history of art student at the Courtauld studying Black British art.
And my name is Paige Schobel, and I'm studying the conservation of easel paintings here at the Courtauld. Oh, no. And first, before we begin, we'd like to thank Maureen, Pippa, and Karen, the leads of the Painting Pairs program, for this incredible opportunity, and to Nathan Daly and Sylvia Amato for their help with scientific analysis throughout this project. We're also grateful for Nino Strachey for granting us access to this lovely, lovely painting, and to the experts, Stephen Rickerby, Lisa Shekti, and Michelle Day, for so generously sharing their research and insights, as well as to the Parochial Church Council of Stowey Church for their generosity as well.
Yes, so as a reminder, these were our original research questions, and we want to build on what we've discussed previously about Strachey's life and the painting itself, and take us somewhere slightly different into the question of what this painting might be doing beyond its allegorical surface. To do that, I want to start with a letter. In a letter written on March 8, 1888, Strachey's uncle, the writer and sexologist, John Addington Symonds, wrote to him with the following opening line. Thank you for your last letter. I'm very sorry that there are no proper photos of the bruisers to be had. Bruisers are big, strong male boxers. And the letter suggests that Strachey and Symonds were exchanging what we might now call queer ephemera. In the same letter, Symonds proposes a composition to Strachey of, and I quote, boys and young men bathing in meadows in twilight, end quote, and implies he sees Strachey's work as a potential vehicle for this aesthetic vision. Symonds is a significant figure in Strachey's life, as they had a close relationship. He is now perhaps best remembered as one of the first writers to use the term homosexual in the English language. Queer himself, he understood the destigmatization of same-sex desire as inseparable from cultural and creative liberation, a liberation he first located in the Renaissance and Greek classical thought. In his book, A Problem in Greek Ethics, written in 1873, he argues, for the student of sexual inversion, ancient Greece offers a wide field for observation and reflection. Its importance has hitherto been underrated by medical and legal writers on the subject, who do not seem to be aware that here alone in history have we the example of a great and highly developed race, not only tolerating homosexual passions, but deeming them of spiritual value and attempting to utilize them for the benefit of society. This use of classical antiquity as a legitimizing framework was common among Victorian artists and writers. Symonds was a pioneer in this project, and he also collaborated with Havelock Ellis to document 52 prominent men they identified as inverts or queer, figures distinguished across the church, the state, the arts, and the letters. This suggests that queer identity was far more present in Victorian life than some may have wanted to acknowledge. And I want to be precise about the term I'm using. I draw on Kathy J. Cohen's 1997 definition of queer, not simply as a synonym for gay, but as a non-normative identity or sexual position that extends to, in her words, all those deemed marginal and all those committed to liberatory politics. This allows us to hold in tension two things that might seem quite contradictory: a potentially marginal sexual identity and Strachey's position as a white, wealthy Christian man, and within a family where wealth was mainly from their connections to the East India Company's exploitation of Indian people and labor. The legal context also matters here. Gay male sex was criminalized in England under the Buggery Act of 1533, originally punishable by death. It was reduced to a life imprisonment in 1861 and was not decriminalized until 1967. Sex between women was never criminalized. Strachey lived and worked entirely within that legal framework. He never married. We didn't find any kind of known lovers. But I want to suggest that this is not simply an absence, and it can be the shape that survival takes. In the previous talk, I gave a detailed reading of Night and Day. As a reminder, the model for Night is Frances Strachey, Henry's sister, and Day is modeled by a local boy from Stowey, a frequent figure in his work. He is believed to be around 14 at the time of this painting, and I want to spend some time on Day. Compositionally, Strachey draws our eyes unmistakably towards this figure. Day is larger in scale than Night and rendered in warm gold tones that advance towards the reader against the cooler, receding blues and grays of the nocturnal left. Where Night is enveloped and partially obscured by clouds and darkness, Day is illuminated. Day is rendered with considerable precision. His features are soft yet pronounced. His gaze is directed away longingly into the distance. His body is partially nude, and a red cloth highlights his slight muscular definition. As Colin Cruz has noted in his essay Coded Desires, in the exhibition catalog for the Tate exhibition Queer British, 1861 to 1967, winged angelic figures were part of queer artists' lexicon, forming a loosely classical style. Read alongside the Simmons correspondence and Strachey's interest in the Italian Renaissance, I do believe that there is a homoeroticism to this painting. This is not to erase the presence of the figure Night. However, the relationship between the figures is not necessarily one of closeness. In fact, the title, Night Pursuing Day, which we landed upon, is one that highlights the contentious nature of the relationship between the two figures. This could be read through the imagery of a male lover shunning his female lover, or as an allegorical painting about queer love. Which brings us to the inscription on the back of the painting from Purgatorio 17, lines 70 to 72, written in both Italian and English, consistent with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1867 translation. The translation reads, "Already over us were so uplifted the latest sunbeams which the night pursues that upon many sides the stars appeared." I want to read them as more than a title source. These lines mark a threshold. Earthly light fading, stars emerging, and only a few lines later, Virgil explains that all sin is a distortion of love, misdirected, excessive, or deficient. The scholar Teodolinda Berolini has argued that Dante's treatment of same-sex desire is more theologically generous than centuries of punitive reception have allowed. In Purgatorio 26, Dante places both heterosexual and homosexual sinners on the terrace of lust. The sin in Dante's framework lies not in the nature of desire, but in its disorder. He opens a theological space in which same-sex desire is not automatically beyond grace. This matters for how we read Strachey's inscription. It can be viewed through the lens of spiritualized self-exploration. In the same letter about the bruisers, Simmons asked Strachey for his work as it is a good example of democratic art. 2 years later, Simmons would publish an essay on democratic art, drawn from Walt Whitman, where he describes it as a, and I quote, "new and more deeply religious way of looking at mankind, and that God the divine is recognized as immanent in nature and in the soul and body of humanity," end quote. The stars emerging as earthly light fades becomes a resonant image for this. The withdrawal of one kind of visibility makes another kind of illumination possible. I want to close this section about the art history by returning to the Bloomsbury connection and specifically to Duncan Grant. Grant and Strachey traveled together in Italy, moving through the Renaissance spaces that both men found so generative. When Grant came to paint his own murals, the stylistic similarities to Strachey's work at Stowey Church are striking. A similar decorative flatness, the same endowed figuration, and a similar composition. The influence may have well moved in both directions. The painting can therefore be understood as part of a potential earlier Victorian genealogy of queer aesthetics, in which Strachey acts as a bridge between Victorian thought from his uncle and the Bloomsbury Group's later association with more visible forms of queer modernism through Strachey's cousins such as Lytton Strachey and Duncan Grant. Henry Strachey's world was earlier and perhaps more coded. It relied on Renaissance references, Christian allegory, Dantean theology, and the language of male beauty. His work belongs to a longer history in which same-sex desire was negotiated through art, spirituality, and aesthetic culture. Strachey was a religious man, active in Christian organizations, including the Scouts and Band of Hope, and that faith, I want to argue, was not in opposition to his queer sensibility, but entangled with it. The painting therefore allows queerness and Christianity to appear together. It does not separate bodily desire from spiritual meaning. Instead, it imagines the body as one of the places where divine meaning can emerge. In the fading of daylight, the stars appear, and in Strachey's painting, the male form becomes a site of revelation.
So early on in our research, we had considered whether this work was a cartoon for a larger mural painting. If so, there becomes an additional tension between public and private life. Toby and I visited the Strachey family archive, and we found this image that you see on the far left there of this from the Strachey family book, which proves Henry Strachey used cartoons and painted studies for figures in his composition, The Last Judgment, at the Stowey Murals in Somerset. In order to first begin considering if Night Pursuing Day was a cartoon intended for a mural or a personal painting of artistic expression, or a bit of both, I compared the materials and techniques in Night Pursuing Day to his documented mural practice at Stowey Church in Somerset that was discussed in the last presentation. IRR, or infrared reflectography, can produce an image that essentially sees behind the paint layers. It is often used to evaluate if the artist used any carbon-containing materials, such as pencils, ink, or charcoal, to create the underdrawing. The image on the left-hand side tells us that the underdrawing, seemingly in pencil, was rather simple, with only minor changes made to the red shawl in the final composition. Comparatively, pencil underdrawing is evidenced in the Stowey murals, but it is unclear how he transferred the cartoon studies to the larger mural scale. Muralists would often perform setting out procedures to help guide the design of their composition, or use it to help transfer the cartoon design to a larger scale. For example, muralists of the Berwick Chapel, such as Duncan Grant, Vanessa Bell, and Clive Bell, used their own set of setting out procedures, such as penciled grid systems or ruled lines. Additionally, Duncan Grant would paint thickly in some areas and very thinly in others, where the underdrawing or setting out procedures would then become visible. Similarly, Strachey utilized similar techniques, painted in multiple layers in some passages while using thin washes of color in other areas of the composition, such as the figures of night and day. The photograph from the previous slide shows Strachey working on studies for the Stowey murals, so we do know that he made cartoons prior to painting, at least for these particular wall murals. Yet there is no other evidence of setting out procedure in Night Pursuing Day. It is also worth noting that the cartoons of the Stowey mural consisted of fragments of the larger composition, in contrast to the seemingly complete compositional study that we see here in Night Pursuing Day. To explore further similarities and/or differences, I performed Raman analysis, excellent at identifying inorganic material, on a small cross-section sample, which identified the ground to be composed of calcium sulfate or gypsum. Additionally, FTIR, an analytical technique used to help identify organic material, was used on a sample from the dark blue background to see if Strachey applied an organic surface coating with a wax component, in the same way that he did to the Stowey murals. The sample did contain some blue pigment, so I unintentionally collected some of the paint layer. The sample from the blue background showed evidence of linseed oil, resin, and wax, all of which I hypothesized and expected, as well as evidence of a polysaccharide, which can also be found in binders such as gum arabic. The surface coating consisting of resin and wax, and the gypsum ground layer parallel elements used by Strachey in the Stowe murals. This could suggest that Strachey was employing muralist techniques to this particular painting as well. As you can remember from the last presentation, the canvas was commercially primed, so he seems to have specifically placed the canvas inside out and then applied this gypsum ground layer, a common ground used by muralists for its porous surface in order to create that fresco-like effect. As I mentioned, my blue background sample contained some pigment, and so from that analysis, I was curious to explore more about the identified polysaccharide or gum-like material and considered whether Strachey used mixed media in this composition. It made me look into different types of paints used by muralists at this time. But first, I think more context is needed into British muralists more broadly in order to have a greater understanding of Henry Strachey. Mural painting in Britain didn't have the tried and tested tradition like it did in other countries like France, Italy, or Germany. But it did have a revival around the 1840s when the palaces of Westminster were being redecorated after the fire, and there was a lot of enthusiasm behind murals from the likes of Prince Albert and artists like Sir Charles Eastlake. Muralists in England learned rather quickly that painting directly onto walls created lots of problems in this country due to the wet weather, air pollution, and overall technical inexperience. British muralists, both artistic muralists and commercial muralists of the time, turned to mural painting in a spirit of excitement rather than habit, and this form of art was developing largely by trial and error, which continued well into the 20th century. Some of the methods and media that were used amongst muralists in the late 19th and early 20th century included fresco secco, spirit fresco, or water glass. The main goal was basically to use a durable paint that was resistant to moisture, found so commonly in this country, while still giving a matte fresco-like effect that was very much in vogue at the time. Even Duncan Grant at the Barrack Chapel used Stick B, a gum emulsion paint that created a tempera effect while being advertised as durable and good for outdoor use. It was invented after the First World War, but began to be used as a decorative paint around 1927. Stick B wasn't quite available then when Strachey completed Night Pursuing Day, but as previously mentioned, various other types of media were being marketed to combat the shortcomings of previous paints and techniques. One such paint was Duresco, created in the 1870s and came to be very popular and marketed for wall murals, churches, or public buildings. It was a washable distemper and made from a petrifying liquid comprised of silica and gums, which could then be combined with oil and water to produce a stable, non-poisonous distemper. It is said that the base pigment for Duresco was lithopone, basically a mixture of zinc sulfide and barium sulfate, but also the use of zinc white as the base of Duresco became increasingly preferred. So the same cross-section that was used to determine the gypsum ground layer was analyzed further. For starters, one can quickly observe the multiple paint layers that were employed, and many of the layers appear applied wet and wet. Additionally, in ultraviolet light, nearly all the layers in the cross-section appear to sparkle and shine a yellow-green, characteristic of the presence of zinc white paint. After seeing this cross-section and reading about Duresco, it facilitated me to consider if Duresco was being employed here, given that its primary formulation relied on zinc white or lithopone, a zinc-based pigment. However, I used analytical techniques such as FTIR and SEM-EDX, which is useful at identifying elements in a paint layer, to test this Duresco paint hypothesis, but it did not provide sufficient enough evidence to corroborate my Duresco paint theory. However, from all of this, I was able to glean the paint is comprised of mixed media. A cross-section stain where orange in UV light indicates oil, the image on the right, and blue black indicates protein, as you can see on the image on the left. So this cross-section stain shows multiple layers. The middle layers have stained positively for protein, whereas the bottommost layers have stained positively from oil. From readings on techniques of Baroque murals in England, it was common for muralists to apply an oil-rich sealant to help resist deterioration from moisture of porous gypsum ground layers and from the buildings. As such, these analytical findings and heterogeneous paint layer structure highlight how he was engaging in muralist techniques in a seemingly experimental way to obtain this fresco matte-like finish. Of course, because Strachey was using muralist techniques does not conclusively point to the fact that this object was certainly a cartoon for a future mural, but there is evidence of compositional modifications. Referring back to an infrared image, you can see the area highlighted within the green boundary appears darker in the near-infrared image. Different types of blue pigment absorb and reflect light rays differently. So while in normal light, the image appears to have a consistent blue background, Strachey added splotches and strokes of a different type of blue pigment. It is unclear whether this was done in the same moment or at a later stage. Notably, in some areas where this blue was applied, the paint is friable with localized areas of loss, forcing me to consider if the blue paint was added at a stage late enough where Strachey was observing these deleterious effects of time and it was applied as a conservation measure, or if it was the addition of this blue paint that caused the deterioration. Further, cross-section samples showed that Strachey used the traditional gold leaf water gilding method on the gold memes, while the silver moon, above the figure of night, showed something slightly different and interesting. There was two leafing layers. Through SEM EDX, we found that the two layers had slightly different elemental compositions, with the bottom layer giving evidence of aluminium and silver, and the top layer having evidence of aluminium but no silver. This area of the composition is incredibly friable, so it is possible Strachey began to see flaking or potential tarnishing of the aluminium-silver leaf, so he re-gilded this particular area at a later date. However, we can observe that he used a glaze, seemingly cobalt blue, over this area to create this luminescent lunar effect. Even in the 14th century, there is documentary evidence of artists such as Lorenzetti and Giotto achieving subtle differences of color by juxtaposing metallic surfaces, or they would glaze over the silver leaf with tinted colors such as green, red, and yellow. Strachey completed other wall murals as seen in the images here. The image on the right is a public commission similar in style to the Brockwell Park murals, likely taking inspiration from the Somerset landscape he was so fond of, while the mural on the left was for a private commission and has elements similar to the atmospheric or dreamlike symbolist qualities we see in Night Pursuing Day. Unfortunately, these murals were either destroyed in the war or painted over, preventing their study of his muralist materials and techniques. To conclude, Strachey was utilizing muralist techniques while simultaneously experimenting with different visual effects or making changes. In Night Pursuing Day, he seems to be seeking the matte-like surface quality associated with Italian Renaissance frescoes, reflecting his interest in achieving the mastery of form and composition that he was so consistently inspired by. And that's us. Thank you so much. Any questions? Let's go ahead.
Thank you so much both for such a lovely presentation. I was just going to ask Paige about the gilding techniques, as expected. The halo of night, when you say that there's a combination of aluminium and silver followed by an aluminium layer, did you see sort of how those two elements are combined? Are they sort of hammered together like two sheets that you get in sort of production of part gold leaf, or are they sort of layered on top of each other?
That's a good question. And also shout out for your reference to the medieval gilding. My understanding was that it looked like there was mordant applied. It looks like it was kind of a mordant type gilding, and then the interlayer in between, you can kind of see it in the UV image. And then as well through SEM EDX, there were some elements that made me think it was some type of glue. So I think it was then another layer of mordant he applied.
Yes, go ahead. That's nice.
building on that, the gilding and the silvering element, and just to understand the frame of reference in relation to frescoes, is that sort of ornamentation typical in frescoes as well, or in, I mean, and if so, what is the correlation between what he's doing?
That's a good question. I was curious that he did choose like water gilding, because from what I was reading, oil gilding is a lot more durable and more was used for outdoor use. So I was, he did maybe just want to like harken back to those like Renaissance elements at the time of using traditional gilding method to get a particular type of visual effect or reflective surface. But I haven't seen personally loads of examples of Renaissance with this water gilding technique. But yeah, so I found it intriguing. It was a question. I wasn't sure why he chose that method, or just again for the visual effect.
I was interested in kind of how he sits, because there's not all that much of a body of work of kind of fresco painting in Britain, but I imagine he probably wasn't the only one, like how he sat within a wider body of fresco painting and that style, and if it was comparable in any way.
That's a good question. I feel like during this time period, from what I was reading a lot of the muralists, it was, still like symbolism, and that was like quite prevalent at this time. And so I think they were using a lot of references to Greece and the Renaissance. But I haven't seen loads of examples of British muralists using these allegorical type styles. So, like this example, that's the one on the far left for a private commission. I found that's a bit more common of an example of, Venus and Cupid or something like that. But with this one, I haven't come across it.
I think that it seems from what I was understanding is that this time period, there's a lot of experimentation. And so we have like this work by Solomon, and I showed this one. And there's a lot of kind of questions and exploration around using allegories to kind of explore identity, and there is sort of this is a hard question, but yeah, I think there is he's not alone in what he's doing. I just think that for this work, especially within his kind of context, it seems sort of out of the ordinary for him, and obviously the evidence that we have of his work is quite limited, so we don't know sort of what other things he may have been doing. And then I think additionally a sort of problem that we had was, although he had relationships with all these different artists, such as the Bloomsbury Group, he's actually not mentioned that often. So it's really difficult to sort of ascertain what those relationships would be like concretely. And so, yeah, I would say possibly, but obviously we don't know as much as we would like to.
I guess my added side note to that is just mural paintings at this time were creating a boom, and like even in like the late 19th century, because there was a prize at the Royal Academy, and so it was gaining a lot of traction, but it was quite expansive. It could be political based or religious based, or types of culture. So I think that they all were pulling from all different types of sentimentality, depending on maybe the setting of the mural.
Can you go back to your last any questions slide? All those fantastic photos from the archive, which you put up, and now I feel like you're obliged to say something about. Thank you so much for that. But what the impression one gets from these fantastic pictures is lots of playfulness and lots of theatricality. And so I sort of wondered, maybe Toby, if you could comment on the ways in which some of these questions around the technique, and you said the word yourself a second ago about experimentation and sort of playfulness, does that kind of reinforce this image that we're maybe getting of this artist as someone who's very playful and
experimental with technique.
So, yeah, I think, so the image on the bottom, I'm really bad at directions, but right, the image on the bottom right is part of a larger sort of group of images where him and his family would be playing at their house, and they would sort of create these fantastical scenes, and the Strachey's were quite close with each other, and so I think there is this sense of them trying to figure it out and playing with each other, and Strachey and Duncan Grant traveled quite a lot with each other, and so yeah, I would agree that I do feel like this work specifically within Henry Strachey's larger oeuvre is quite playful, and I think that's honestly what probably makes it a little bit difficult is, and Paige and I talked about this a lot, is we're kind of art historians we don't have any evidence of, his experience painting this, and so, we can't necessarily ascertain what his feelings were like, but there is sort of this level of playfulness that I think existed in his larger life that is coming out in this work as well.
Well, I think you were very clear at describing what a complicated character he was, and responding to the time and what was going on, and then that really played out in the complication of what the object really is. Is it a cartoon? I think it's a good.
And he was, I think, just a Renaissance man in general. Like, he was a writer, he was a musician, he was a painter, muralist. So he likes to do it all, I think, and I think that's where a lot of maybe the experimentation comes in.
Take these last two questions, I think, and then go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you so much. I suppose my question is related to the recent ones in the sense that I'm interested in how you adapted your kind of research approach in face of the lack of evidence and the obvious evidence around queer history, and also what was it like using a family archive as well. I think that's often so relevant to National Trust collections, reading between the lines, and what was your experience of that, and did you find yourself adapting as you went along?
Yeah, I think, my initial question was really sort of around Duncan Grant, and I spent time just kind of looking at the work and thinking about it, and I really love this idea of critical fabulation by Saidiya Hartman, so really trying to read between the lines, understand that there's going to be gaps in the archive, there's going to be gaps in what we know and understand, and so just being able to sit with that. And I think this is a moment of me kind of fabulating about what the potential meaning behind his work could be. And then I think after reading the Coded Desires essay and really understanding that, in a context where being queer was largely illegal, you have to use different languages to sort of express your queerness. And even I was reading a lot about Oscar Wilde and how he, with his lover, would talk about bruisers, and that was a really, that was kind of a coded way for them to talk about their love for each other. And so really continuing in that tradition with this work. And then I think working with a family archive is always a fun experience. There are some, so since he didn't have any children, his archive went to his sister. And so there is this potential loss that may have happened during that time. But I think knowing that the Strachey's were quite immersed in literary and artistic traditions, and spending, I think the Simmons thing was really helpful, and kind of understanding that relationship to sort of my ideas around queer identity. And yeah, and just being open to the idea that artists are complicated beings. And it doesn't have to be sort of this definitive statement about his life. It can be sort of speculative.
a relationship.
Good afternoon, thank you all for coming and to our peers for their really interesting presentations.
I'm Sarah and I'm studying Easel Painting Conservation here at the Courtauld.
And I'm Lucy and I'm studying MA History of Art. As a reminder from our first presentation, this was seen as attributed to Paul Nash with the title Wood Interior dated 1919. Mentioned, though not photographed in Andrew Causey's catalogue of Nash's works, the plausibility of this painting Wood Interior has been critical to our research, situated within the key questions that we have chosen to address today.
Interrogation of Nash's style, art historical context, archival research, and study of the materials has aided in our deductions of whether the painting aligns with Nash's work, attempts to narrow the date range of the piece, and propose possible locations of the scene depicted. An accompanying line of questioning has surrounded the whited out painting on the reverse and how each intervention relates to one another. Technical imaging has proven essential in providing some answers, but this has perpetuated further questions surrounding context and provenance. We will address each of our research questions in turn, beginning with attribution.
To provide a brief contextual background, Paul Nash was born in London in 1889 and died in 1946. His career is often divided into three phases: his early development and First World War work as an official war artist, his engagement with surrealism in the 1930s, and his return to official war commissions during the Second World War. However, this periodization tends to obscure the significance of his interwar practice, which remains comparatively under-examined in existing scholarship. The early 1920s can be understood as a transitional yet highly generative phase in Nash's practice, constituting a period of sustained experimentation in which Nash refined his visual language and deepened his engagement with the natural world. More broadly, Nash's work sits within a wider contemporary tension concerning whether it was possible to go modern while remaining British. In parallel, Nash's technique underwent a marked transformation. Having worked predominantly in watercolour before the First World War, he increasingly turned to oil painting as his primary material. This shift enabled greater experimentation and contributed to the formal and atmospheric variety evident in his interwar work. In order to assess the strength of the attribution to Paul Nash, it is necessary to examine to the extent to which its treatment of subject matter and composition aligns with his established practice. As Roger Cardinal argues, Nash's work can only be understood through the recurring motifs that appear through his painting, drawing, photography, and writing. These include, most prominently, trees, clouds, fences or gates, and waterways. This provides a useful comparative framework through which to present the work, through which the present work can be evaluated. A first point of comparison lies in the depiction of tree canopies, shown in the upper row of this slide, suggesting a degree of correspondence with his established visual language and potentially with his documented engagement with specific landscapes of the period. However, these forms are not direct transcriptions of observed nature. Rather, they're increasingly essentialized and geometricized. In works such as The Backwater, Nash reduces natural forms to an interplay of tonal contrast, using the relationship between light and dark to construct form, rather than relying on descriptive detail. This reflects Nash's interest in underlying geometry of landscape, a structural logic that he repeatedly identifies within natural forms, particularly trees. Such abstraction indicates a shift towards a more conceptual engagement with landscape through formal reduction. A similar line of analysis can be applied to the motif of fences and gates, shown in the lower comparative examples. Nash frequently described trees as possessing a present analogous to human forms, and later extended this to suggest that immersion within wood space implies enclosure and protection. Here, the fence or gate functions as a threshold device. It both demarcates the landscape and regulates access to it, structuring the viewer's relationship to the pictorial space. The background trees function as an archetypal woodland, rather than the depiction of individual specific specimens. This mode of representation anticipates the broader formal language associated with Nash's later interwar work, particularly if the proposed dating of 1919 is accepted. On the right, a comparable treatment of branching structures is evident, which non-naturalistic curves converge to form articulated networks of limbs, ending in sparse foliage. Rather than descriptive naturalism, these forms operate as interpretations of the tree as structure. The painting is characterized by short, controlled brushstrokes in which individual marks remain visible, with traces of brushes' bristles still discernible within the paint surface.
This handling corresponds broadly with the hobhair brushes like those held in the Tate Archives Paul Nash collection. This mode of execution is closely related to a broader structuring of paint into discrete tonal units and rather than continuous blending, often allowing areas of the ground layer to remain partially visible through thinner applications. While this approach is less consistently evident in Nash's work before and in 1919, it becomes more characteristic of his oil painting practice in the early to mid-1920s.
As mentioned in the last presentation, comparison with Paul Nash paintings shows similarity in this exposed ground between block paint passages. Wider research has shown this to be the case throughout the interwar period, and this observation is corroborated in Tate conservation reports for Behind the Inn of 1922 and Harbour and Room 1932 to 1936. We can also try to deduce method and order of application. Looking at this raking light photo, particularly these trees in the top left of the painting, we can infer that conferred by the disruption of the impasto strokes that the dark green background has first been applied and then scraped back for the two slanting tree trunks to be added. This technique of scraping back to create a sort of hollow, particularly for fences and posts or trees, is visible in some of Nash's works. The raking light image for Harbour and Room shows a similar construction for the central white mast, appearing set into the surrounding water. Unfortunately, as this photograph was in the Tate conservation records, we aren't able to share the image. Identification of underdrawing with microscopic examination and confirmed through infrared imaging shows consistency with Nash's preparatory technique. The underdrawing aligns closely with the composition we see, suggesting few changes were made between the drawing and painting stages, most obviously the extension of the yellow shape at the bottom left. As a documented part of Nash's process of building up compositions, evidence of underdrawing is seen in Souvenir of Florence, dated 1929. In this case, a combination of gridding and lines denoting shapes and angles in the composition are visible through the thinner paint. Pencil has also been used after paint application to add or accentuate compositional details. This is evidenced here in the rope between fence posts, achieved through scratching into the still wet paint, creating a slight reservoir, and in the ruled lines reinforcing the geometric fence structures. Similarities can be drawn to Nash's landscape at Iden of 1929 in the pencil reinforcement of the central basket and circular stacked lots. While interesting comparisons, none of these details of style or technique amount to a definitive attribution. Regarding the paint materials, there is unfortunately a lack of published analysis of Nash's pigments and oil paints of choice. The Tate holds one of his paint boxes, though from the addresses listed on the Newman paint tubes, it can be inferred that these paints would have been from later in his career. They do, however, suggest consistency in pigment selection if the artist is Nash. Here we have burnt Roman ochre and raw sienna. Both are earth pigments consistent with the elements identified in the painting. Presence of chrome lemon has also been confirmed through identification of chromium and barium in paint mixtures in the greens and the whites.
Canvas was Nash's more typical support. As the comparative material here indicates, his use of plywood is not implausible. His earliest known oil work appears to have been executed on board, and Andrew Causey's catalogue records a small number of oil paintings on board, although the specific material is not consistently identified as ply. Notably, wood interior is not catalogued among Nash's works on board, which limits the strength of material-based attribution. However, in the immediate post-war context, financial and practical constraints make it likely that Nash worked opportunistically across the available supports. Given that the brothers John and Paul Nash often shared studios during the period in which his painting was produced, we have also considered the possibility of John Nash as the artist of this work. The use of plywood is of particular interest as this material is more frequently associated with him. The brothers' artistic approaches to landscape and their responses to the post-war context were remarkably different, however. While Paul became increasingly focused on developing a new modern visual language, John tended towards observational naturalism and a search for continuity and stability. Their engagements with landscape diverged accordingly. John's work, often informed by wider British travel, retained a more descriptive and representational character. Contemporary accounts also describe him as being more attentive to the natural objects in their own right, with a sensibility that contrasts with Paul's more abstract and structurally driven treatment of form. In light of these stylistic and conceptual differences, the rendering here is more consistent with Paul Nash's practice than that of John Nash. As noted earlier, no image is published in Courtauld's catalogue, and so the date remains provisional. This absence requires a broader reading beyond the fixed 1919 label. Particularly in light of material analysis to come, it may be more closely associated with Nash's early to mid-1920s practice. In particular, the handling of brushwork appears to sit between 1919 and the more resolved oil technique evident in Wood on the Downs, where this approach is developed further into more cohesive and structured application of paint, refining the directional and segmented handling already present in wood interior.
With the early 20th century a period of notable development in paint manufacture and industrial production, we had a number of possible signifiers to look out for in aims to narrow the possible date of the painting. To begin with the most full-scale angle of investigation, we looked into the plyboard itself. The detail of this being a 5-ply board is significant. In Claire Signy's survey of the Tate's collection of paintings on plywood, only George Brack's Nude of 1925 is documented as 5-ply, with all of the cases of noted thickness being 3-ply. While the stronger 5-ply was preferred in artist manuals of the mid-20th century, 3-ply was more common, cheap and in abundance during the interwar period through reuse of tea chests and packing case panels. While the 20 by 24 inch imperial dimensions of this board align with a common tea chest size, the additional ply layers make this unlikely. The ability to date the support itself would provide an earlier stage for every intervention. Identification of the adhesive used to adhere the ply layers could narrow the dating based on when they were introduced. The most notable improvement in manufacture came in the 1930s with the introduction of synthetic thermosetting resin glues. Using Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, or FTIR, we could differentiate between the natural and synthetic glues. However, this requires an adhesive sample. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, the very good condition of the board means we can't get access to the adhesive, so we couldn't pursue this method any further. Regarding the paint layer, identification of titanium with handheld X-ray fluorescence was of particular interest for dating. In the case of titanium dioxide white, there are 2 forms. The earlier anatase form was commercially available from around 1924 in Europe, and the later rutile form not until 1937. Using Raman spectroscopy, we were able to identify the titanium white paint in the tree on the right to be titanium anatase. This identification cannot definitively push the date beyond 1924, as there remains some contention surrounding the earliest dates of titanium anatase use. But we can say that it would be very unusual for it to be earlier.
Relevant exhibition catalogues do not provide an image of the work either. In the London Group exhibition, however, the painting is dated as 1920, further complicating the proposed 1919 attribution if it is indeed the same work. The absence of any reference to the support is also notable, although exhibition catalogues of the period rarely documented beyond medium. Furthermore, Courtauld acknowledges that his catalogue is not exhaustive, particularly for works held in private collections. However, the dating inconsistency in terms of style and material analysis seems to point to a different time period and therefore Nash work. Our final art historical avenue for confirming the wood interior title, and therefore its date, was to trace the painting's provenance in the hope of locating an image that could confirm its identity. The work belonged to Mrs. Leo Myers in 1928. Through her daughter, E.Q. Nicholson, she was connected to Paul Nash's artistic circle through his friendship with Ben Nicholson, dating back to their time at the Slade. However, despite exploring some records and correspondence, no evidence was found linking Mrs. Myers to the painting beyond 1928, nor did any description or image of the work emerge. While this research provides an interesting insight into Nash's artistic networks, it ultimately offers little evidence for connecting our painting to wood interior.
So now to move on to the reverse of the painting, the specific questions we developed regarding the back are listed on the slide here, relating to the concealed composition and the overpaint covering it. In the previous presentation, we shared this X-radiograph, which was unsuccessful in revealing the concealed composition on the reverse, having been masked by the heavy elements in the front composition. Only the circled lines here could not be accounted for. We therefore conducted macro X-ray fluorescence scanning, which produces maps of the elements present in the painting. The orange and green images shown here, mapping iron and manganese respectively, are most descriptive in showing another landscape scene. They both likely correspond to earth pigments in the composition like umbers and siennas.
Paul Nash's brushwork is typically controlled, layered, and used to construct form. The reverse is executed with longer, looser strokes that appear more sketch-like and provisional in character. While both compositions depict a view through trees towards a distant building, they do so from different viewpoints and through markedly different approaches to paint handling. This indicates a shared subject rather than a definitive relationship between the two works.
Examination of a cross-section taken from the bottom left of the verso also shows difference in their stratigraphy. The ground and paint layers are thinner and individual pigment particles of seemingly unrelated colours are dotted throughout. This can be seen in the blue and red particles in the ground layer or the orangey red particles in the paint layer. This perhaps indicates use of a dirty brush or mixing with multiple remaining colours on a used palette to create a beige off-white ground colour, for example. A final difference noted upon close examination of the board verso under ultraviolet light is the presence of a varnish layer which stops about 2 mm from all edges, consistent with varnishing in frame. Coupled with the tentative identification of a signature in the bottom right, this indicates a finished painting that has been framed for display at some stage.
In attempting to identify the artist of the painting on the reverse, the initials were examined first. The first character appears to be an M, although it's partially smudged. The second is less clear and may be read either as a capital C, G, or lowercase r. Searches for British artists using these combinations have produced no convincing matches. While not providing an artist for the reverse, it does rule out the fact that the idea that it was completed by either Paul or John Nash.
Similarly, there is nothing materially that definitively indicates the date of the painting. Based on their distribution within the composition and areas of overlap between elements, we have been able to infer possible pigments. The concentration of cobalt in the sky, for example, seen here on the right, suggests cobalt blue. The significant overlap of manganese and iron relates to earth pigments. The probable pigments deduced generally align with the early 20th century dating. The presence of copper in the central area, however, presents some questions. Emerald green contains arsenic, which is unidentified here, leaving fewer realistic options. There is a possibility that this is phthalocyanine blue or green. To obtain this information, a sample would need to be taken from a copper-containing area to perform Raman spectroscopy. This poses a challenge with composition concealed, though this is a continuing line of inquiry. While identification of phthalocyanine blue or green could indicate later dating of the painting, as it was not in use until the 1930s, with this all concealed beneath overpaint, we cannot discount retouching or later reworking. Information gleaned could inform our interpretation of the relationship between each intervention and their order, or hint towards overall later dating if it could be confirmed that this painting was executed first. But ultimately, this illustrates all the unknowns we are faced with when analysing and interpreting the results of a concealed composition. While only an assumption based on logical working processes, we think it is likely that this painting was executed first. This is based on the board quality. In plywood manufacture, there is a front and a back face. In plywood middling quality, it is common for the defects, like knots, to remain in the back while being avoided or removed and plugged with a similar veneer in the front. The board face, with the painting attributed to Nash, is of a comparatively worse quality. The losses on both side edges likely correspond to soaring during manufacture, with most containing original paint. There is also a knot in areas of non-original water-soluble fill and retouching materials, probably former knots, suggesting effort was not taken to remove them during manufacture. It seems logical that the better quality face would have been used first, so while we cannot gather the precise date from the board, its condition could act to infer something of the relationship between each intervention. This leads us to the white overpaint. Using Raman spectroscopy, we identify the titanium white pigment to be the rutile variety, dating this intervention after 1937. The difference from the titanium anatase on the front composition suggests that this was not the same campaign. The development of the rutile form did not, however, entirely discontinue the use of titanium anatase white, so while it can be inferred that this overpaint intervention came later, this is not a distinction we can definitively make. We were unable to identify the binding medium using FTIR analysis as hoped, as the peaks displayed aligned with components of both oil paint and alkyd paint.
Since titanium white was used in both artist and household paints by the 1930s, it makes it difficult to conclude who painted over the back. Two main explanations remain possible. A dealer may have sought to conceal a work considered unrelated to or potentially detrimental to the painting on the front. However, the broad and practical application of the paint together with the apparent use of a large brush suggests the later owner's intervention may be a likely explanation. To conclude, while we cannot definitively attribute this painting to Paul Nash with certainty, our research has shown that both its materials and technique are broadly consistent with this practice. At the same time, the identification of titanium annotate white raises questions about the traditional dating of 1919 and consequently its identification as wood interior. Investigation of the reverse has further demonstrated that this object has a more complex history than initially apparent. The discovery of the concealed landscape and the later overpaint intervention suggests that the sequence of execution was likely the reverse, composition first, followed by the painting attributed to Nash, and finally the application of the white overpaint at a later date.
While many of our questions remain unsolved, this project has brought into focus several promising avenues for further research, including closer analysis of the signature on the reverse, further analysis of possible pigments, and potential identification of the landscape location through comparison with sites known to have been painted by Nash during the revised date range. Thank you very much. Is everyone tired? Yes.
Can I ask if you've had discussions with Nash experts and whether there's been any kind of more connoisseur gut feeling responses?
So we personally haven't, but the owner has had a lot of those discussions already in the past with experts at the Tate, and they weren't able, from what we know, to sort of give anything any more definitive or less than our sort of interpretation of paint application and style.
Was it common for Paul Nash not to sign his works?
Yeah, based on the catalogue, it's a bit of a mixed bag. He did a bit of both. Yeah.
Yeah, he wasn't very consistent with much.
It wasn't even that he did in a certain period of his practice. It was just
Yeah, so throughout the 1920s, they were continually moving around, particularly, both of them were moving to different areas, but Paul Nash stuck to sort of southern England, and they would overlap in certain places. They would work in London together as well.
Did they collaborate?
I think actually his first oil painting ever was a collaboration with John, but I don't know much else about their individual collaborations beyond that.
Is there a possibility then that it could be a combination of both in terms of if it's, I don't know, if the back bit was done by one, maybe
I think the signature on the back the fact that doesn't correspond to either brother sort of suggests that it wasn't either of them. And also the style seems quite different to either of their practices. But without figuring out who that is on the back, obviously we can't really say anything else. Yes.
Did you come to any conclusions of why there are so few paintings by Paul Nash from, say, 1919 to 1923, considering he was a full-time painter? As far as I understand, there are very few from that date, certainly in public collections.
Yes, I think in public collections there aren't that many because it is very much a transitional period for him. Yeah. So it's not distinctly war and it's not distinctly into his surrealist period after. So it's kind of, they often have quite a lot of changes within that period, even in technique, because Menin Road was one of his first oil paintings ever, which is a very significant work to make as your first. And he also, his wife did destroy quite a few of his paintings as well later on. So, but also it's kind of an underexplored aspect, so that means public collections are less likely to obtain the work. Yeah.
Do we know why she destroyed them?
Don't know specifically why, but she has destroyed quite a few of the oil paintings specifically. I've seen in the catalogue it listed the title and everything about it, what it looked like, and it says Margaret Nash destroyed. So who knows? Yes.
Is that the end of the road for investigation, or are there developments?
Well, my treatment will continue, so I'll continue treating the work, and that will probably entail a bit more investigation if that is necessary for the direction of my treatment. If there's any sensitivities or anything like that that scientific investigation can usually help with.
And then I'll progress further into the idea of location, but because the date kind of opened up beyond 1919, it poses quite a few different locations to go through and compare. But before the report's handed in, I will try and explore specific locations a bit further.
There's a non-restorer here. Really stupid question. Can you remove the titanium white on the back?
But I haven't tried, in terms of whether it's physically possible, that's not something I've explored yet, but it's a huge ethical question of whether that should be done. Because we don't know very much, we still don't know very much about who put it on or when, that's just a why. It's not really something that I could go into without any of that knowledge. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, it's just up to me to thank you all for coming. I think they have done a phenomenal amount of work. We can give them another round of applause. This program highlights is that you can do a lot of work on your own, but you have a lot more fun and you go a lot further when you work in collaboration. So we are hoping that this is a program that brings together the conservation and the art history as a team going forward. And I also want to thank all the owners of the paintings, without whom we could not do these projects. And I want to thank my co-conveners, Pippa and Karen. And I want to say a big thanks, of course, for the endless support of the Research Forum, and for Diego and Grace and Leila, all of whom made this possible today. So that said, you can all join us for our celebratory drinks just down the hall in the Research Forum meeting room. Thank you.